Dan McClellan made a video about me, and I have a couple things to say. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of what Dan said, but before I do that, you need to have some context. In the video that Dan was responding to, somebody asked me if the Trinity was anywhere in the Bible, and I responded with a few verses that I believe point to the Trinity. Dan made this in response.
There's absolutely nothing about this text that points unambiguously in the direction of, or that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever demands or requires the philosophical framework of three co-equal, co-eternal, and consubstantial persons comprising the single ousia or essence or being of God. That conceptual package didn't even exist yet. It is nowhere articulated anywhere near the composition of these texts. It would take centuries to develop, and we can actually chart the slow and painstaking development of the idea. There's trial and error, and there's alteration before we arrive at what we know as the Trinity today.
Before I respond to what Dan just said, I want to preface with the fact that he is objectively smarter than I am. He is a well-educated biblical scholar, and I am an 18-year-old recording in my bedroom. That was also just a clip of his entire response, so if you want to know all of his ideas on what I said, you should go watch his video. Now, while I recognize his intelligence, I do think some of the claims he made in his response were biased by his LDS beliefs. This is my response to Dan. I could bring up a whole bunch of verses that point to the fact that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all co-eternal, consubstantial, and equally God. But instead, I think it's better to address the historical claims that you made about the Trinity. So yes, the word Trinity was not used until 200 AD, until Tertullian came up with it in his writings against Praxeas. This was over 100 years after John wrote his Gospel. However, just because we didn't have a word for it does not mean that the concept of the Trinity wasn't around way before then. For example, in his letter to the Ephesians, Ignatius of Antioch, who is a disciple of John, writes about Jesus being God and proceeding from the Father. He wrote this only 7 years after John died, meaning he probably got this idea from John. When John wrote the Gospel, he most likely had in mind the same Trinitarian theology that he passed on to Ignatius. And there are tons of other references to this theology before we get the word Trinity, like the writings of St. Paul, St. Peter, and the Apostles' Creed. It's kind of like guitars. We have a bunch of instruments throughout history that resemble guitars, but we don't have an official name for it until much later. It's not to say that the idea or concept of a guitar wasn't widely accepted up to this point, we just didn't have an official definition for everybody to agree on. And this makes a lot of sense with Roman oppression. It's pretty hard to hold ecumenical councils discussing the Trinity when Christianity is illegal and punishable by death. And that's why you don't see widespread agreement on the Trinity until Constantine makes Christianity a legal thing to practice. So Dan, I love your stuff, but I disagree with your point of view on the Trinity.